Good morning. Today we begin the book of Exodus, and hopefully we're familiar with Exodus, the story of Moses and the Israelites. Roughly 400 years have passed since Joseph died at the end of Genesis, and the Israelites are still in Egypt, and they are now slaves. And in verse 6 it says a new king had risen in Egypt, and they no longer remembered Joseph and um, all of what Joseph had done. There were no more Hebrews that were, in high positions. But the Hebrews were becoming very plenteous in number. And this new king was afraid that the Israelites, the Hebrews, would rise up and revolt and overpower the Egyptians. We read that in the first few verses um, of chapter 1. And then when we get to verse 15, the king says to the Hebrew midwives, uh, and he names a couple, when you act as midwives to the Hebrews, set them, if it's a boy, kill that child. Make sure that, because we got to control these Hebrews. And, the Hebrew midwives, I mean, they're killing their own. And I remember thinking, well, it was the Egyptians that were midwives, but, it wasn't. It was the Hebrews, themselves. Um, but the midwives, didn't have any respect, it tells us, for this new king, this new Pharaoh, and they let the boys live. And when they were questioned, they said, well, by the time we get there, the mother has already delivered the child and cleaned up, and it's too late. We're too late. And um, but um, but things happen, and then and then Pharaoh commanded his people, every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let the girls live. And um, but it's just it's reminiscent to me, or it reminds me of after Jesus was born and the killing of the innocents, of all of those children, male children under 2 years of age. But uh, it's a horrible story. We know that. And then chapter 2, there was a man of the house of Levi. The one of the because chapter 1 began with the 12 tribes of Israel, those names, and so this a man of the descendant of Levi married a woman, and she bore a son, and she hid him. It says for 3 months. This is Moses. We know this story. And when she could no longer hide this child, she put him in this wicker basket down by the water, and had Moses' older sister go down and watch to see what happened. And of course, the daughter of Pharaoh came, and while they were walking along the river, they saw this basket, and she opened it up and saw this child, and the child was crying, and she took pity on him. And she says, this must be one of the Hebrew children. And so she recognizes that, and she knows that, these male children, they're to be thrown in the river and drowned, but she has compassion. And again, this is the way we see God working in and through so many things, and of the struggles and everything going on. And so we know what happened. The Pharaoh's daughter, pulls him out, and of course then Moses' sister says, oh, I know a Hebrew woman that could be a nursemaid for him. Of course, takes him back to his mother. I mean, what a sweet turn of events this is. And so yeah, that happens, and Moses' mother then is paid to take care of her child, and the child grows up, and when it says verse 10, when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son and named him Moses, because he was drawn out of the water. And so this is if we were just reading this story for the first time, we would, there's be so many questions as to what and how and why and all of this. But since we know the story, or I mean, if you don't know the story, we'll learn the story together. We'll talk about it. But Moses grows up and he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. And these Hebrew slaves were worked very hard. And Moses has compassion. And he says, why do you know, or he saw two Hebrews fighting, rather, I'm sorry. And no, to start with, it was the Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he killed that Egyptian, you know. And the next day there were two Hebrews that were fighting, and he calls them out on it. And they had seen this, you know. Moses had hoped that he had not been seen, you know, killing this Egyptian, you know, trying to hide it. But when they say to him, do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Moses feared for his life and ran. Because when Pharaoh found out, it tells us that when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. Moses fled. And we know the story there too, as he fled and he came to this land, and as he got to there, he saw some shepherds driving some people away, the 7 daughters of this priest who were trying to water their flocks, and the other shepherds, you know, drove them out of the way. But Moses stood up for them, drew the water, watered their flocks, and they went home and told their father, and they said, well, where is this man? Go and bring him here. And so Moses then finds favor with this man, the priest of Midian, and this man gives Moses his daughter Zipporah in marriage. And but after Moses has been living there for quite some years, God comes and speaks to him. And so in verse 23 of chapter 2, a long time the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. And out of their slavery their cry came to God, and God heard them and remembered his covenant with Abraham, it tells us. And in chapter 3, verse 2, the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a burning bush. And Moses saw that bush burning and not being consumed, and he thought, I got to turn away, I got to go away. But the bush called out to him, called him by name, and Moses said, here I am. And went over and heard from the bush. The bush said, I am the God of your father, Abraham. And Moses hid his face. And here is the call then for Moses to be the one that goes to Pharaoh and says, let my people go. And but verse 13, Moses isn't so sure, and Moses said, if I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me, they'll say, well, what is his name? And then God says, I am who I am, and I am, and it's just this, it's a present tense, it's a past tense, it's a future tense, I exist. And tell them that I am has sent me, Moses, to you. And so he goes and he assembles the elders as God had told him, and he says, God is speaking to Moses. He says, I know that the Pharaoh isn't going to let the people go. He said, I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wonders I will perform, and after that he will let you go. So here's the God knowing what's going to happen, knowing that Pharaoh isn't going to let these slaves go. I mean, if Pharaoh lets all the slaves go, who's going to do the work? Certainly not the Egyptians, but it all comes to being that way. But he says to Pharaoh, I will bring to Moses, I will bring this people into such favor with the Egyptians that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. The Egyptians will fill your hands with gold and silver and jewelry and usher you off on your way. And so we have in these first 3 chapters of Exodus, as I mentioned, we're 400 years roughly now since the time of Joseph's death. And the Israelites have been in Israel all those years. And as we were reading in the book of Genesis earlier, it talked about those 400 years that the Israelites would be these foreigners in the land. And so the whole story ties together. And sometimes we want to take one verse or one chapter or one book out of and just say, here it is. You know, and as we read through the book of Exodus, and then we get into the history books, you know, the others, and you know the prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah, and you know they're quite a bit later as we read the Bible. But you know, and the reality is that those prophets are very involved in First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles for sure. So to try to take one book and say, well, here it is, you know, that's not it, because the whole story